Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this seminar of the School of the Wisdom. It's going to be 3 days with 3 different presentations. Each presentation will be 30 minutes, followed by 50 minutes questions and answers. So the theme of our seminar is Theosophy and Ecology, Practical Wisdom for Living in the Contemporary World. The opening session is with our sister, Linda G., Linda Oliveira, which all of you know. Linda G. is a second-generation Theosophist who joined the Theosophical Society in Australia in 1971. After hearing some talks of the philosopher J. Krishnamurti. Later, her degree at the Australian National University focused mainly on psychology and political science. She was the national president of the TS in Australia, as well as editor of its national magazine for a total of 16 years during 2 periods, the second of which was completed in January 2021. Linda G. was the International Vice President of the Theosophical Society from October 2008 until late 2011, serving 2.5 years of this period at ADR, the Society's international headquarters here where we are in India, before returning to live in Australia. She has lectured and given study classes for the TS in various countries. Linda holds a strong conviction that a genuine exploration and reflection upon Theosophy, the perennial wisdom, provides to those who are awake and alert the possibility of a profound human spiritual transformation. Before passing the word to Linda G., our sister Radha Raghunathan will make a short prayer dedicated to Lord Ganesha.
Om Gajananam Bhutaganadisevitam Kapitta-jambu phalasara-bhakshitam Umasutam shoka-vinashakaranam Namami Vigneshwara-pada-pankajam Om Sarva-vignaharam devam Sarva-vigna-vivarjitam Sarva-siddhi-pradataram Vandeham Gananayakam.
Thank you. Mrs. Erica Georgiadis, brothers and sisters, both near and far, greetings. The theme for this mini School of the Wisdom is such an important one considering the world today and where we find ourselves. Theosophy and Ecology, Practical Wisdom for Living in the Contemporary World. So let us begin with where we are here and now and consider the world environment in which we find ourselves at this point in human history. According to Theosophical teaching, we are incarnated in this particular Kali Yuga, which is an immensely long period according to ancient Indian teachings, in fact 432,000 years. This era is said to be marked by egotism, by conflict, by materialism, being an immensely long age of material advance and what is contrasted with this as spiritual darkness. Now, I think with all theosophical teachings, we need to really think for ourselves and consider whether there seems to be truth in what we are reading, rather than just soaking everything up and then repeating it. Now, I cannot verify the length of Kali Yuga, but what do we find when we gaze around us? We do see conflict. We do see suffering of all kinds. We see a pandemic. We see a climate crisis. We see the perennial competition for power. We see egotism in various forms, an enormous emphasis on things material. We see conflict. We see the terrible war in Ukraine, and so forth. So when we look at the state of the world around us, perhaps the predominant state, it seems to resonate well with the general idea or teaching about Kali Yuga, as far as I'm concerned. And indeed, the yugas, which are a subject in themselves, a substantial subject, featured in several places in HPB's writings. She wrote, for example, "The world moves in cycles, which proceed under the impetus of two mutually antagonistic and destroying forces, the one striving to move humanity forward towards spirit, the other forcing mankind to gravitate downward into the very abyss of matter." Dramatic words indeed. The contrasting forces of the material and the spiritual are brought to light daily in the life of one who is seriously interested in the workings of the divine. In The Secret Doctrine, while explaining the esotericism of the Rig Veda, Madame Blavatsky mentions, "Divine aspirations are no more general, but have become abnormal through a general spread of ahamkara, that is the feeling of egotism, self, or I amness, and ignorance." Just to repeat that, divine aspirations are no more general, so they're not diffused all over the place today. But those divine aspirations have become abnormal because of the spread of egotism, self or I amness, and ignorance. Indeed, narcissism has been found to be a definite phenomenon of our time, which is an extreme form of egotism. Now, all this aside, it's remarkably easy to blame others for the plight of the world that we live in. It's very easy to point the finger, as it were, at somebody else. But we all know the most basic principle of Theosophy, which is that fundamental, unshaking, undivided, abiding unity of existence. Existence, therefore, is one thing. Existence is one thing, not a collection of separate things. We are all aspects of and participants of this one life, even if we feel ourselves to be separate entities at times, and perhaps much of the time we do. This basic truth of our existence has large implications. For one thing, we all bear responsibility as individuals for the state of the world, both materially and spiritually. We're going to consider very briefly now some ecologically inspired thought, and then turn to Theosophy for some insightful perspectives on how we can live more effectively in the contemporary world. Ecology itself has been defined as the study of the interaction of people with their environment. So it's the interaction of us with our environment. We all have a relationship with the environment around us, of course, in numerous ways, including the natural environment, such as the beautiful one here at Adyar. Various other related fields have emerged from ecology. For example, spiritual ecology is a relatively recent term that refers to the intersection between religion, spirituality, and environment. And its practitioners are said to fall into three categories. Firstly, the scientific and academic spiritual ecologists. Secondly, the category of spirit or religious environmentalism. And thirdly, religious and spiritual individuals who relate strongly to the environment. There's also much literature available in the field of spiritual ecology. I also want to make very brief mention here of eco-philosophy, which has been described as the philosophy of ecological harmony or equilibrium. The philosopher Dr. Henryk Skolimowski may be someone that some of you remember. He remarked that we need to change the whole structure of our consciousness. We need to change the whole structure of our consciousness, which is programmed towards manipulation and mechanistic thinking, resulting in an instrumental treatment of people and nature. That is, treating others and treating the nature around us as objects, not as expressions of the sacred. It does not give other people or nature their due place. For him, for Dr. Skolimowski, living more effectively in the world therefore demanded a complete metamorphosis of consciousness. Now, selfishness in its numerous manifestations has a causal relationship with treating the life around us in this instrumental fashion, using other lives as a means for our own advancement or for our pleasure. In contrast, the quality of the mind which emerges when consciousness thoroughly mutates has sometimes been called a pure mind. Dr. Skolimowski called it a reverential mind, which is a term that I find very attractive. A reverential mind. More on reverence a bit later on. Turning now to Theosophy. Divine wisdom is not some kind of ultimate object which is outside of us, rather it lies within us waiting to be revealed in an ultimate sense. We can think of it as our ultimate state of being. All true wisdom is self-validating when it actually alters the quality of consciousness, when it improves our relationship with our inner and outer environment. Then wisdom is self-validating. And when it expresses itself daily in the way in which we live. Some may find themselves so caught up in the technical aspects of theosophical teachings that these occupy their minds above all. The teachings naturally have their place, of course. These are the important scaffolding upon which it is possible to gain an orderly and universal perspective on life at all levels. However, can the teachings change us through and through? Can the teachings change us? No. It is only we who can bring about meaningful change in ourselves. This requires careful attention and dedication, and a will to change by working on ourselves even in the very smallest of ways daily. Indeed, the commitment to a complete metamorphosis is the greatest human journey, the culmination of numerous incarnations, which demands that we infuse ourselves with certain qualities which are likely to work against many lifetimes of conditioning. There is, of course, a vast corpus of theosophical literature. So I thought to try to distill just 3 essential qualities which run through that literature and which could help us each to live more effectively in the contemporary world. And these are 1, unselfishness, 2, simplicity, and 3, reverence. Unselfishness is an antidote to egoism, to narcissism. It embraces so many other things, such as ahimsa as well, which in its purest form negates any conflict whatsoever. So we can see how unselfishness is a marvellous quality to develop during Kali Yuga. Secondly, simplicity helps us to become kinder to the planet, kinder to the other lives upon it, and it's an antidote to the excesses of consumerism. Thirdly, reverence. This is an antidote really to the instrumental treatment of people and nature, which was mentioned before, and it upholds the sacred dignity of all life. So let us look at these one by one now: unselfishness, simplicity, and reverence. Firstly, in relation to unselfishness, one of the holy ones made some significant comments about this. The first object of the TS is philanthropy. The true Theosophist is a philanthropist, not for himself, but for the world he lives. Just to repeat that, the first object of the TS is philanthropy. The true Theosophist is a philanthropist, not for himself, but for the world he lives. This is a breathtakingly lofty ideal when you think about it, living for the world. Thinking practically, we can ask ourselves some questions. For example, for how much of the day do I live for myself? For how much of the day do I live for the world? Do I really care for the world? If so, am I doing something about it in my own small way? Am I prepared to give of my time, my spiritual energy, and my resources to help uplift the world in some way? Am I consciously considerate of the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom, as well as the planet's resources, generally through my own personal habits? Such questions may reveal a great deal. Another quote on unselfishness from the Mahatma KH again is, selfishness and the want of self-sacrifice are the greatest impediments on the path of adeptship. The greatest impediments are selfishness and want of self-sacrifice. For those who are attracted to the ideal of the spiritual path, there may exist for many people what is really a kind of conditional desire to tread the path, in the sense that they are not willing to be sufficiently unselfish and not willing to sacrifice very much. It may be quite easy to live in our comfort zone, hoping that if we are basically good, then we will attract the attention of the holy ones. But perhaps we live in the world more selfishly than we imagine, without even realizing it. We may tend to give of ourselves to others when it is convenient for us. But on the other hand, our higher evolution into pure self-realized beings requires of us, among other things, frequent inconvenience. Not so palatable, is it? But frequent inconvenience. It is significant that unselfishness brings with it the clarity of a far broader perspective on life, which is unaffected by personal judgments, by preferences, by prejudices and concerns, other concerns. Because unselfishness is a truly beneficent force in its own right. It cascades into many of the finest qualities, such as ahimsa, kindness, consideration for others, awareness of the suffering around us, compassionate action, beneficial thoughts directed towards others, a spirit of helpfulness, and so forth. So unselfishness is like a kind of a treasure, and when you unwrap it, it has all of these wonderful manifestations. Now we come to the second quality, simplicity. What of simplicity? It has been said that real simplicity, and this was by Brother Sri Ram, the Society's 5th International President, he said, real simplicity springs out of the elimination of all that is superfluous, all encumbrances and hindrances, retaining only the essentials of value. This morning, the 3 gems of theosophical literature were mentioned. And retaining those essentials which are of value brings to mind the first of the qualifications for the path which were brought to the world in that little gem at the feet of the Master. That is discrimination or viveka. We can understand this quality as spiritual discernment, which helps us to understand what is truly important in life and what is not. What is excessive and reasonable in terms of how we live every single day in a deeply materialistic world. Viveka also applies to what we choose to feed our minds in this age of global interconnection and large volumes of information. It's so obvious with the enormous amount of information that is around us and which we can choose to take in or not. It is there all the time. Viveka also applies to what we choose to feed our minds. And for example, this electronic communication and the large volumes of information today require from us a kind of filtration process, if you like, really, because we can become overwhelmed by too much information. So this modern technology generally, for example, needs to be used appropriately and should not replace the fullness of direct relationship. Direct relationship, not relationship which is mediated by some electronic gadget, for example. Wise discernment helps us to know what is good for our mind and what is not, what is truly essential for us in life and what is not. And this really comes down to what it is we really want more than anything else in life. That will determine what is really essential for us. Dr. Robert Elwood observed the important thing is that one set up priorities based on the reality of the spiritual as well as the material side of nature. So priorities are key, which makes perfect sense. We each need to determine our own priorities. A discerning return to simplicity in many ways can help to arrest fragmentation. At a practical level, we may each have different ways of addressing this. Wants and needs vary between people and cultures. I once visited a small theosophical group. There was a lady there, and she was very proud to say that she had decided she didn't need her home, so she sold her home, she gave away all the proceeds to charity, and then she lived after that by house sitting, house minding for people. That was her choice. That was her priority in terms of simplifying her life. What one society regards as a need might be regarded as a luxury elsewhere, of course, too. And then we may reduce the number of our possessions, but this may not necessarily reveal a simple nature. Krishnaji once said, "Simplicity of the heart is of far greater importance and significance than simplicity of possessions. To be content with a few things is a relatively easy matter. To renounce comfort, to give up smoking and other habits does not indicate simplicity of heart." So that's something that's interesting to really give consideration to. He said that to put on a loincloth in a world that is taken up with clothes, comforts and distractions does not indicate a free being. So simplicity is a state which comes about from within. It may manifest in giving up certain possessions, but not necessarily so. And we each have to decide for ourselves what is enough. On the whole, the simpler we make our lives, the more energy we have for everything that we carry out, bringing to each task greater quality and attention. Simplicity also helps to make us calmer. I don't know whether you've ever noticed this. Sometimes we create too much complexity in our lives in different ways. And when we can reduce that complexity in some way and come to a simpler point, it can be incredibly calming and very tranquil. Paradoxically also, there can be greater abundance in life when there is greater simplicity. Our minds are continually caught up in the process of generating ideas and explanations, and that creates more ideas and more explanations. You can observe this in your mind. Strong mental activity can spoil the immediacy of our experience. Have you ever gone for a walk, perhaps in a forest, in some beautiful area, in a park? You've walked along and got to a certain distance and realized that your mind was elsewhere, that you have not been enjoying the journey. And this is a case of just that, strong mental activity spoiling the immediacy of experience. Some of the greatest human beings in the world lead or have led remarkably simple lives. In an illumined, reverential mind, quality takes precedence over a life which is driven by quantity in its many expressions, including consumerist excesses. I'm not suggesting that we get rid of our possessions. We all have material needs, and each person's situation is different. But it's for each one of us to determine for ourselves how much is enough, what is not really necessary, and all of that. So I believe it's worthwhile to consider the benefits of greater simplicity and less complexity, and setting about to discover the difference between a life which is simply too complex and a life which is more simple, more peaceful, and abundantly full. I've suggested 3 main qualities which can help us to live more effectively in the contemporary world. The first 2 were unselfishness and simplicity. This yuga is the age of Kali, driven by materialism in so many ways. Clearly, undue indulgence in materialism fosters selfishness. It creates a fertile breeding ground for selfishness. And there are distinct advantages to simplicity. Finally, we come to the 3rd quality, which is the quality of reverence, something which one can see in considerable abundance here in India. The treatment of the planet's resources and other people instrumentally, that is for one's own advancement and comfort and pleasure, and without a sense of the divinity of all life, really reflects a shallow and uncaring life. Taken to extremes, it leads to spiritual bankruptcy. Reverence is a quality of the mind which is informed by a movement of the heart. Reverence is a quality of the mind which is informed by a movement of the heart. The mind is clearly prominent in human evolution during our era, but the developed mind ultimately needs to be softened by our inner heart, mutating into that reverential mind mentioned before. Otherwise, the mind hardens. The flowering of reverence is a truly beautiful thing. Such a mind venerates life and is infused with inner radiance. It would be less concerned with the complexities of self-centeredness and more concerned with other forms of life, really appreciating and feeling and sensing the sacred in the other. A fundamental principle in the tradition of Advaita Vedanta is Atman is Brahman. Atman, the highest or subtlest aspect of the human being, is also mysteriously rooted in Brahman or universal spirit. And this relationship is inherently dependent upon the quality of our mind. The mind is crucial in all of this. We can deduce that the matter, the movements of a reverential mind must be more flowing, less convoluted, and have even a greater simplicity than the very complex mind that can easily take over. The reverential mind will apprehend the sacredness in all. It doesn't waste energy on trivial things. Reverence needs to be nurtured in order for us to become whole. The more we deepen our experience of and the conviction of the sanctity of all life, the more we will enable the blossoming of the glorious being we are destined to become. We do find pockets of life during this Kali Yuga, pockets of light, in the form of individuals who embody much compassion and wisdom, along with other spiritual qualities. despite the daily challenges of our present world period, there are still many scattered souls in incarnation around the planet who actively work for goodness in their various spheres of life. We know this and should take heart from this when we hear another piece of bad news in the media. Such individuals do not necessarily succumb to materialism in its entirety. Rather, they have the discernment and the skill to live within this material age without losing sight of their divine roots. The introduction of Theosophy to the modern world by Madame Blavatsky infused much needed light into the world at that time, which was during this age, this long age of Kali, and not so far from the beginning of it. And Theosophy is deeply ecological. Why is this? Because its teachings point to the possibility of a sacred relationship with our whole environment, with our entire environment, not just the outer environment, but also that which exists deep within the recesses of our very being and which links us profoundly with the universe. May that sacred relationship, which is within each of us, flourish.
Thank you very much, Linda, for such a wonderful and very inspiring presentation, focusing on three qualities: unselfishness, simplicity, and reverence. Now we are opening for questions. We have time. If anyone would like to make any comment or question, please raise your hand and step up here to use the mic. And try to be brief. Here, sir.
Check.
Okay.
With due regard to all my brethren, just I like to know the Kali Yuga, which is in an evolutionary process, representing the material in abundance rather than the consciousness. So clearly, we have introduced a new word, and that is spiritualistic ecology. So the life between the spiritualist ecology and the materialistic ecology, they are in operation. There is an infight. So when there is an infight, the result, either it is good or bad, the bad will teach you and give you the reverence. Because we have seen the war is going on in Russia and Ukraine. So the overall effect on the humanity of that war will give a reverence to think inside, and it will make a upward good thought among all of us so that we can eradicate that bad influence. Is it true or not?
Thank you very much. Linda G, would you like to comment, please?
I didn't fully understand the question. I think you were talking about essentially the struggle between the spiritual and the material, and that reverence may come out of that, perhaps. I think for any human being who becomes more aware of the fact that there is more to life than this spiritual world, and begins to have aspirations towards the divine. For any human being like that who really wants to commit themselves more to the divine, there is this struggle, an internal struggle, and it can be a daily thing, because one moment something can push us towards the material, but then we might remember something uplifting we have read and replace a certain thought in the mind with something which is more uplifting. It's difficult to know in a way where reverence comes from, but I think there's a sense within us all that there is more to life than what we see around us. And there's some kind of sense of our divinity. People chase this divinity in all sorts of different ways, and quite often ways which are inappropriate. And they may, for example, use drugs or go to various extremes. But I think it's important that we try to become more aware of that sacred presence within and nurture that in whatever way we can. Find, for example, some inspiring textbook which we can focus on and we can meditate on, because only we can do that work of changing ourselves. And when we begin to thin down that barrier within the mind, which is occupied with all sorts of things of a material nature, then it starts to allow an opening for the divine to enter our consciousness more. And then I think that reverential mind starts to really take hold increasingly. But we have to nurture that. We have to really create the conditions in which that reverential mind can flower. And this again comes back to, I suppose, very practical everyday life practices. For many people, regular meditation or prayer becomes a very important part of daily life. And this can help to really change the quality of the mind, because the mind can very quickly be drawn away from that after a period of meditation, after things during the day take hold. For humanity as a whole, when we think about the material as well, often it's only when there is some sort of cataclysm or crisis that really collective, meaningful change comes about. We look at the world's climate at the moment, for example. Somebody agrees with me over here. We look at the world's climate crisis now, and we see various nations starting to cooperate, because there is more of a collective sense of something which is to be protected. And I believe that collective sense is not just to help the material nature of the earth, but I think that there is this growing sense of unity which comes about when there is crisis. We find the same thing during periods of war, for example. It brings people together, or just general adversity. It brings people together in ways that we might not otherwise have imagined. But the challenge, I suppose, is not to wait until there's some kind of crisis, even in our own lives, but to think for ourselves about what is really important and what is not, and to start to develop healthy practices which will help us to basically become better human beings and better citizens of this planet as well.
Thank you, Linda.
There are some roving minds there.
Sorry?
They have some roving minds.
A roving microphone.
Okay, I did not know. Thank you for informing. So, is there anyone else who would like to ask a question? Yes, please.
Linda, I wonder whether the issue of self-criticism arises here, and what I'm thinking of is that often self-criticism can be almost an unhealthy thing, and whether you would like to comment on self-awareness as opposed to self-criticism, because I think self-criticism can lead to not necessarily healthy in its manifestations.
Yes, I think we need to learn to be able to look at ourselves attentively, watch ourselves, to watch our thoughts, watch our speech and all of that. But there can be a fine line sometimes, because it is easy to go down a path that becomes too negative and too harsh. And along with this, therefore, there is nothing like a healthy sense of humour. I think we need to be able to laugh at ourselves sometimes. We all trip ourselves up. We might see something in ourselves that we don't like, but we need to be able to really have a laugh at ourselves. Being aware of ourselves really requires us to be able to almost take a little step back and watch, and try to watch without judgment. That can be very difficult, but it's a very interesting exercise to try to do just that, to watch ourselves. And funnily enough, when we see something in ourselves for what it is, even just one quality, which may not be all that wonderful, that quality starts to recede, but we really need to see it for what it is. I think we have to be careful with this process. It may become too intense for some. I think we need to practice this in a small way and then perhaps gradually expand that so that we become more aware of ourselves during the day, but not just ourselves, of others around us as well. Otherwise we can become perhaps spiritually too self-centred. There can be a kind of spiritual selfishness as well. So we need to be able to balance this in our lives.
Thank you. Is there any other question? Linda, how long do we have still, please?
According to me, maybe 3 or 4 minutes.
All right, so there is time for one last. Please, Charlie.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Sister. Now, I heard you mention examples of what we refer to as simplicity in the material, as well as what is not a simplicity in the heart. But could you provide us examples of what could be a manifestation of simplicity of the heart?
Simplicity in the heart.
In the heart, yes. Thank you.
When one thinks of the heart, one thinks of love. And I think that the ultimate simplicity of the heart is a very, very pure form of love. I suppose there are different kinds of love. Some love is more limited. Sometimes it can complicate our lives. But ultimately, I think that simplicity of the heart is something which wants nothing for itself. This is the ultimate in the simplicity of the heart, but just gives itself in love to all around. Not so easy to attain, a very lofty ideal indeed. But I think it's something that's worthy of consideration. We often, I think, once selfishness is there, then the heart is not pure, you know. And often our love is combined with some kind of selfishness as well. But absolutely pure love is on a level of its own. It's quite extraordinary. It might be touched occasionally in deep meditation, but it's a different kind of simplicity. It's not just the simplicity of material possessions. And I think it very much relates to a greater order in the mind, a greater simplicity of mind as well, which is open to the divine. So that reverence is there, that reverential mind is there. And I think then simplicity of the heart has oxygen to breathe.
Thank you very much, Linda G, for the truly wonderful presentation. Let us live today thinking of unselfishness, of living for the world of simplicity, viveka, discrimination, and of a reverence of mind, which in essence comes from our heart. Those are three essential qualities for us to help building a better world. So thank you very much. Tomorrow we will be back here again at the same time with our sister, Dr. Radha Raghunathan. Linda G, thank you so much for inspiring us and for such a wonderful presentation.